With advancements in military technology, wars became more and more global. Often a skirmish in one seemingly unimportant area would have long-term strategic consequences. 30 years after the Russo-Japanese War, the USSR and Japan were struggling over the borders in Mongolia, and that led to the battles in Khalkhin Gol in 1937. This minor conflict proved to be among the most crucial fought in the pre-war period. If you're interested in the history of this era, don't forget to check out our second channel, The Cold War. The link is in the top right corner. The sponsor of this video, Magellan TV, is a new type of documentary streaming membership which has the richest and most varied history content available anywhere. Ancient, modern, current, early modern, war and biography. Magellan TV strives to give you insight and knowledge on the topics you are passionate about and always succeeds in doing that. Being a member of Magellan TV is a must for anyone who wants to learn more about World War II. We use their documentary playlists World War II Battles Won and Lost and Lost Battlefields of the World Wars in our research, and both are excellent in their coverage of the battles, campaigns, leaders and strategies of this global conflict. We like Magellan because it can be streamed from anywhere and on any device without any ads and no limited access. New programs are added on a weekly basis, and many of them are available in 4K. If you haven't signed up to Magellan yet, support our channel and do that at try.magellantv.com/kingsandgenerals. You'll get a free 1-month membership trial. Thanks to Magellan for supporting our channel in these difficult times. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire was expanding its influence in the Far East. But the victory in the Russo-Japanese War allowed Imperial Japan to check that and gain control over Korea, Manchuria, and South Sakhalin. The Soviet Union tried to recover its hold over the region, successfully aiding revolutions in Mongolia and China. The 1930s saw Japan increasing its interest in Mongolia, and the region more generally, as they invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932 and advancing into Inner Mongolia 1 year later. The Japanese had suddenly and violently acquired a 3,000-mile border with the USSR and Mongolia, and this border was very ambiguous and subject to dispute. Soon the Japanese army stepped up its presence in the region, creating a quasi-independent military force and government known as the Kwantung Army. At the same time, the Soviet Union began bolstering its defenses and signed a mutual assistance pact with their Mongolian satellite state in 1936. In 1937, Stalin purged the army, wiping out 80% of the staff in the Far East. Japan saw this debilitation of their rival and decided to exert some pressure on the Manchurian frontier. On the Amur River, the Japanese managed to occupy Kanchetsu Island as a result of one of their many border skirmishes. On July 7th, the Marco Polo Bridge incident ignited a full-scale Sino-Japanese war that would weaken Japan in their possible war against the USSR. Soviet aid to China and the Japanese divisions being tied down in Manchuria helped prevent a swift Japanese victory, which emboldened the Soviets to take a tougher stance. In 1938, this culminated in the Battle of Lake Khasan, called the Chankufeng Incident in Japan, where Japanese forces occupied the disputed area but withdrew after heavy fighting. Although they managed to repel their foes thanks to the actions of Commander Grigory Stern, the Soviets suffered more losses than the Japanese because of the incompetence of Marshal Vasily Blucher. However, this battle showed the shift in the balance of power in the region, and the Soviet Union now had more forces stationed on the Manchurian frontier than the Japanese. In mid-1938, the Japanese 23rd Division was created within the Kwantung Army, assigned to Hailar and responsible for frontier security in northwestern Manchukuo. Subordinated to the infantry division was the 8th Border Garrison Unit, composed of some 7,000 Manchukuoan troops. The 23rd Division was composed of 3 inexperienced and ill-equipped infantry regiments, and was commanded by the inexperienced General Komatsubara Michitaro. The Soviet High Command countered by relocating the 57th Special Rifle Corps, consisting of the 36th Motorized Rifle Division, 11th Tank Brigade, and 7th, 8th and 9th Armoured Car Brigades, to Mongolia to defend its border with Manchuria. The corps was led by Commander Nikolai Feklenko, and the Mongolian forces were commanded by Marshal Khologin Choibolsan. The hero of Lake Hassan, Stern, replaced Blücher as the commander of the Far Eastern Front. Since 1935, border conflicts had occurred around the Mongolian-Manchurian frontiers across the Halha River, known as the Khalkhin Gol to the Mongolians. The Soviets claimed that the border shouldn't be across the river, but some 10 to 20 miles east and through the tiny hamlet of Nomonhan. To establish that, on May 11, 1939, a 20-man Mongolian border patrol crossed the Halha River, moving eastwards towards Nomonhan. The patrol was discovered by the Japanese, and a Manchukuoan cavalry force of about 40 men was sent to drive the Mongolians back across the river. Some casualties were sustained by both sides, but the Manchukuoans had drawn first blood. The next day, a bigger border force, commanded by Major Chogdan, pushed the Manchukuoan cavalry out of the disputed area. This spurred both sides to appeal to their protectors. General Komatsubara dispatched Colonel Azuma Yaozo on the 14th of May to lead reconnaissance into the disputed territory and expel the intruders. This force consisted of an armoured car reconnaissance company, 2 infantry companies, and some cavalry. Azuma discovered that the Mongolians had retreated, leaving small elements on the banks of the river. An airstrike was ordered on these forces by Komatsubara. The Soviets were furious at this strike and decided to support the Mongolians. Feklenko was away from headquarters at the time, so he hurried back to the Mongol capital of Ulaanbaatar to dispatch a mixed force of infantry and motorized artillery, commanded by Major Boykov, to support the Mongolian 6th Cavalry Division in securing the border. Boykov had around 1,000 infantry and 1,250 Mongolian cavalry. Several skirmishes happened in the disputed area and gradually grew in intensity, while the Soviets started building a bridge near the junction between the Halha and Holston rivers. On May 20th, Japanese reconnaissance discovered Boykov's forces, and Komatsubara decided to send a strike force under Colonel Yamagata Takemitsu, composed of the 64th Infantry Regiment and Azuma's reconnaissance force. Having around 2,000 men, Yamagata was ordered to destroy all enemy forces east of the Halha River. The attack was set to be launched on May 28th, with Yamagata planning to trap the enemy forces on the eastern bank of the river as Azuma's force went south directly towards the bridge, cutting off the enemy's escape route. Boykov had placed his infantry regiments on the flanks and the Mongolian cavalry in the center, with 1 infantry regiment and his artillery in reserve near the bridge, while Yamagata concentrated his forces at the town of Kanchiamiao north of Nomonhan. In the morning, the battle began with Yamagata's infantry attacking Boykov's force near Nomonhan. The lightly armed Mongolian cavalry was routed and driven back, forcing the Soviet infantry to retreat as well towards the river. Moving closer to the river, the Soviet artillery and armoured cars came into action, slowing the Japanese offensive. Boykov was able to regroup his forces near the bridge and started counterattacks, forcing Yamagata's men to dig in. Meanwhile, Azuma went south and soon found himself encircled by the Soviet reserves on the bridge and the forces under Boykov. Refusing to retreat and under heavy artillery fire, Azuma's forces were annihilated on May 29th, and Azuma himself died, while Yamagata was unable to regroup his forces and come to his rescue. Later that day, Yamagata retreated back to Kanchuamiao. The First Battle of Khalkhin Gol ended with almost 500 Japanese casualties, and the Soviets occupying the disputed territory with less than 100 casualties. In the aftermath, the Kwantung Army misinformed the Japanese General Staff, assuring them that everything was in order, while the Soviet 57th Corps headquartered in Tamsag Balak, an airbase in Mongolia. On the 5th of June, Soviet High Command decided to replace Feklenko with a young but capable commander named Georgy Zhukov. Reinforcements were allocated to strengthen Zhukov's new command, and an aviation unit under Commander Yakov Smushkevich was assigned to Tamsag Balak. the Soviets now had around 12,500 men, 109 artillery pieces, 186 tanks, 266 armoured cars, and more than 100 aircraft in the region, with more tanks arriving daily, bolstering the number to 500. On June 19th, 2 Soviet airstrikes near Kanchuemiao caused the Kwangtung Army's Major Masanobu Tsuji to draw up plans for a large-scale attack across the Halha River and to reinforce the 23rd Division with additional forces, including the 2nd Air Group under the command of General Gigi Tetsuji, and the excellent 26th Infantry Regiment with an armoured tank detachment under General Yasooka Masaomi. The Japanese now had 15,000 men, 120 artillery pieces, 70 tanks, and 180 aircraft. Tsuji's plan was to approach the Halha River and seize a group of hills called the Fui Heights, some 11 miles from the Soviet bridge. They would secretly build their own bridge nearby, and after crossing the river, they would strike southward to the Soviet bridge, while Yatsuoka's detachment would push south from the Fui Heights in a pincer movement, leaving the Soviet forces trapped near their own bridge. To secure Japanese air superiority, needed for the success of the plan, on May 28th, Tsuji sent the 2nd Air Group in an airstrike against Tamsak Bulak. The raid was highly successful, and around 100 Soviet planes were destroyed, but the strike was against General Staff orders, and this soured relations between them and the Kwangtung Army. In the Far East, General Stern had sent trucks with supplies and reinforcements eastwards to Zhukov's position. The Japanese misinterpreted this as a Soviet retreat, and decided to rush the offensive's preparations to the start of July. Sensing a forthcoming attack, Zhukov moved his 11th Tank Brigade, 7th Mechanized Brigade and 24th Mechanized Infantry Regiment to the west of the Halha River. The offensive started on July 1st at 4 am, with the Japanese forces marching undetected 20 miles towards the Fui Heights. The following night, a battalion of the 71st Infantry Regiment silently crossed the Halha River and built a pontoon bridge between the two banks. When the bridge was completed, the main body of Komatsubara's 23rd Division, along with the 26th Regiment, began a slow and arduous crossing. They had to proceed without tank support, but could carry their old artillery and anti-tank guns. The Japanese achieved complete tactical surprise and found the Soviet forces in a vulnerable position. The battle began on July 3rd, when General Yasooka's tanks attacked the 149th Mechanized Infantry Regiment on the eastern bank of the river, while Komatsubara occupied the Bain-Sagan Hill on the western bank and continued southward. Unaware of Komatsubara's position, Zhukov ordered his 11th Tank Brigade, 7th Mechanized Brigade, 24th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, and the Mongolian 6th Cavalry Division to advance northeastward to Bain-Sagan. Early in the morning, both sides were surprised by the encounter. The Soviet tanks took the initiative and started the attack, but the Japanese enjoyed air support, and their anti-tank guns were highly effective. Now aware of the enemy's plan, Zhukov sent the 7th Brigade, 24th Regiment, and an armoured battalion of the Mongolian 8th in an attempt to hold the Japanese at Bain-Sagan. The assault was uncoordinated and lacked infantry support, allowing the Japanese infantry to destroy at least 120 tanks. But the repeated tank attacks forced the Japanese to dig in by afternoon. Zhukov had managed to stop their advance. On the eastern bank, Yasuoka enjoyed initial success, beating the 149th, getting a few miles away from the bridge, but would later face increasingly determined Soviet resistance. Yasuoka's vanguard was led by 2 tank regiments of Type 89 medium tanks, designed primarily for an infantry support role. Zhukov's anti-tank defenses were as effective as the Japanese ones, even using strands of piano wire to immobilize tanks. Meanwhile, Yasuoka's infantry was forced to dig in for protection against artillery fire and tank counterattacks. Even worse, the appearance of Soviet aircraft, led by Smushkevich, removed Japanese air superiority. By late afternoon, Yasuoka's advance was stopped and his tanks had to retreat. Having his plan thwarted, Komatsubara finally decided to retreat at nightfall. The 26th was left in Bainsagan to cover the retreat, suffering heavy losses. On July 5th, after destroying their own bridge, Komatsubara's forces regrouped at the Fui Heights. 4 days later, Yasuoka did the same, ending the Japanese offensive. Even with numerical superiority and tactical surprise, the Japanese had failed once again. They had lost 10% of their infantry and 60% of their tanks, and while Soviet losses were heavier, they were easier to replace. Several night attacks ensued in the next 2 weeks, with the Japanese facing supply problems. The Japanese gradually advanced close to the bridge, but as they suffered heavy casualties, Komatsubara decided to halt the attack. When artillery reinforcements arrived, led by General Uchiyama Itaro, a new attack was launched on July 23rd, but it ultimately proved fruitless against the overwhelming Soviet artillery, stopping 2 days later and bringing the total Japanese casualties to 5,000 since May. Meanwhile, Zhukov was given autonomy from Stien's command as the leader of the new 1st Army Group, receiving reinforcements and supplies, including 2 artillery regiments. Stien's line of supply was efficient, and this gave the Soviets the upper hand in preparation. With war looming over Europe, Stalin wanted the Nomonhan incident dealt with by August, while the Japanese sent General Ogasu Rippei to take command of the Kwantung Army and seek a peaceful solution. In August, Zhukov strengthened his forces with the 57th and 82nd Infantry Divisions, 6th Tank Brigade, 212th Airborne Brigade, and 2 Mongolian Cavalry Divisions preparing for a Soviet offensive. Ogasu supervised the operation from his headquarters and placed Komatsubara on the front lines, being reinforced only with the 28th Regiment from the 7th Division and adopting a defensive posture. He placed Manchukuo cavalry on his flanks, with his infantry in the center, fortifying his overstretched line. Zhukov discovered this disposition thanks to the 149th Mechanized Infantry Regiment's reconnaissance, and drew up a plan of attack to exploit the enemy's weaknesses, dividing his army into 3 strike forces. The Central Force, under his command, was to launch a frontal assault and tie down the main Japanese strength. At the same time, the heavily motorized Northern and Southern Strike Forces, commanded by Colonels Aleksinko and Potapov, were to turn in the Japanese flanks and force the enemy into a Soviet encirclement. By August 20th, Soviet forces had secretly moved east of the Halha River. A mobile strategic reserve, built around the 212th Airborne Regiment, the 9th Mechanized Brigade, and a battalion of the 6th Tank Brigade, was held west of the Halha River. At 5:45 am, Soviet bombers and massed artillery began pounding the enemy's positions. At 9 am, the offensive started with a dense morning fog, which gave them the element of surprise. This left the Japanese in disarray until midday, when resistance stiffened. Potapov's southern force achieved the most striking success, with Mongolian cavalry routing the Manchukuoans and the Soviets managing to hold Komatsubara's southern flank. Aleksinko saw initial success routing the enemy cavalry north of the Fui Heights, but the heights were a natural defensive point, and the Soviets were halted there by Colonel Ioki Ichiro. Zhukov's central force saw furious resistance, but prevented Komatsubara from reinforcing his flanks. In the air, the Soviets provided air support for their infantry and managed to best the 2nd Air Group. On August 21st and 22nd, Potapov pierced the Japanese main defensive line at several points, and even managed to reach Nomonhan 1 day later. A Japanese force composed of the 28th Regiment, led by General Morita Norimasa, and the depleted 26th, 71st and 72nd Regiments under General Kobayashi Koichi, was tasked by Ogasu with stopping Potapov in the south. But only the 28th and 72nd reached the battlefield on August 24th for the assault in the morning. A dense fog limited visibility, and so the Japanese tried to use this to gain the element of surprise, but they found themselves abruptly confronting a larger Soviet force. Kobayashi's infantry regiments were lacerated that day, with high casualties and the general being gravely wounded. Morita, on the other hand, saw himself battered by Soviet bombardment and had to retreat. After 3 days, Zhukov relieved Aleksinko because of his lack of success, and reinforced the northern forces with the 212th Mobile Reserves, renewing their assault with heavy bombardments on the heights. Outmatched, Aoki suffered almost 600 casualties and finally decided to retreat in the night to save his men. With the fall of the Fui Heights, the Soviets began to envelop the Japanese towards Nomonhan. A day after, the Northern 11th Tank Brigade linked up with the Southern 8th Armoured Brigade at Nomonhan. The Japanese centre was trapped by August 25th, and Komatsubara's line was cut into 3 encircled pockets. Morita's brigade tried to renew their assault to save Komatsubara, but he failed and was struck down by gunfire on August 26th. One by one, the encircled artillery was pinned, and Komatsubara's infantry was overrun. On August 27th, Ogasu realized he lacked the strength to defeat the Soviets at Nomonhan and decided to retreat with his remaining forces. The situation was hopeless for Komatsubara. August 28th saw the last remnants of Japanese resistance eliminated. Many Japanese officers chose to commit suicide instead of surrendering. Komatsubara was about to do the same when Ogasu ordered him to attempt to lead his men to safety. On August 30th, Komatsubara managed to escape encirclement and retreated with 400 survivors. By August 31st, the battle had ended, and the disputed territory was clear of Japanese occupation. Komatsubara had lost almost 20,000 men, 80% of his forces, rendering it the worst military defeat in modern Japanese history up to that time. The Soviets lost around 25,000 men, more than the Japanese, but demonstrated to their foes that they were a force to be reckoned with. This shifted Japanese expansion from a northward to a southward course, leading to the outbreak of the Pacific War. In Russia, Zhukov and Xian, among others, would be commemorated for their performance, while the staff of the Kwantung Army would be relieved from their command because of their insubordination. Several Japanese officers, including Aoki, were unfairly forced to commit suicide, and Komatsubara was recalled to Tokyo and forced into retirement. Under the General Staff's command, the Kwantung Army adopted a defensive stance on the border, and peace talks ensued. The Molotov-Togo Agreement of September 15th stipulated the ceasing of all hostilities. 2 years later, the Japanese would recognize the Soviet-claimed border east of the Halha River. A non-aggression pact was signed on April 13, 1941, heavily influenced by the outcome of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. This pact was decisive during World War II, as the Japanese decided to honor the agreement and not attack the Soviet Union during the German invasion and Operation Barbarossa, which would have been catastrophic to the Soviets as they couldn't have withstood a two-front fight.